Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Logic, Young Sinatra 4. This is the fourth studio album from Logic following up last year's Everybody, and when it comes to Logic and his music, I enjoy his music at times. I would consider myself somewhat of a fan of Logic. However, I'm by no means a diehard fan of his, and particularly in recent years with some of his most recent output, I haven't really been all too thrilled with it. I thought Everybody was kind of an average album overall. It was just kind of way too all over the place with its concept and all that type of stuff. And I feel like some of the more recent mixtapes he's dropped, like the Bobby Tarantino series, hasn't really been all too interesting to me either. So coming into this new album here from Logic, for one thing, I was pretty surprised that we were getting a project from him so soon, considering he just dropped Bobby Tarantino 2 earlier this year, about half a year ago or so from when this album was released. So I was really surprised that we were getting an album so soon, but still, of course, I was interested in checking it out and seeing what Logic was going to do here. And on this project overall, I would say that this is a step up from Everybody overall, but I'm not sure it's that much of a step up, honestly. And I still think that overall this ends up being a pretty average project, in my opinion. It definitely fixes some of the problems I had with Everybody as an album, but some of the problems still linger, and this album here also throws in some new problems of its own as well. I will start by talking about some of the things in this project that I actually like, because as I said before, this project does improve on Everybody. I feel it does some more things right compared to that album. One of those things is scrapping the over-the-top concepts pretty much. I felt like with Everybody there was just way too much going on, and the concept got way too out of hand and just didn't work in the album's favor all that much. This album doesn't really have an overarching concept or anything, with the exception of like the opening skit, which continues from where the skit on his last album ended. Following the story that's kind of been going on through his albums. And I say story kind of loosely because there's not really all that much to it. Pretty much just listening to the Logic albums. Pretty much just the only type of bigger concept, I guess you could say, running throughout this thing, and even then it's just like a skit at the beginning of the album all that much, where they, it picks up where the last one left off, where, originally they were saying that, they were going to start Logic's fourth album, his final one, and here it's like, it's his final one. No, it's actually his final Young Sinatra album. Fake out, he actually has like 1,000,000 albums, they say, or something like that. So I can't wait to review all those albums for the rest of existence. That's why it's called Music Forever, this channel, because we're here for forever to review every piece of music that ever exists. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. As for the things I like on this album, yeah, I like the fact that he kind of abandoned any greater concept. I like the fact that he stuck to kind of the basics here with many of these songs. It just works out better, and allows for some of these songs to kind of be their own thing and be better on their own. None of them are really tied down all that much to a greater concept or anything quite like that. And as a result, we get a good handful, or a few tracks, I would say, that are somewhat enjoyable. My favorite on the album easily would be the track Wu-Tang Forever, which features, of course, the Wu-Tang Clan on it. This 8-minute long track is pretty enjoyable, mostly because of the Wu-Tang Clan, who are on this thing and take up the majority of the runtime. Logic's only on this song for about a minute or so, and then the rest of the members are given their time to shine pretty much, and it is very enjoyable. A great feature overall. And Logic himself, while I do think he has the weakest verse on this track, he still manages to at least rival, I guess you could say, or match the energy that the other members brought. And overall, it is a very enjoyable track. That's one I could see myself coming back to from this thing. And the more, boom bap styled production across this album works very well here in this track, considering who's featured on it. Despite the fact it's one of the longest on the album, it's one of the best as well. And I'm sure many people, scattered out this track alone just to listen to it because of the Wu-Tang feature. And honestly, that's worth doing if you are a Wu-Tang fan and you're, kind of on the bridge whether or not you want to do it or not. I would recommend giving the track a listen. Maybe not necessarily the full album, but this song in particular is worth your time, I would say. There's also a few tracks later on in the album that I thought were at least somewhat interesting. You have the title track, Young Sinatra 4. And an interesting part about this track is it's in part kind of dedicated to Mac Miller, who recently passed away, and Logic kind of explains on this track how one of his beats that he would end up rapping over in one of his earlier projects was a big inspiration to him and all that. So it makes the tribute here on the song a bit more personal, a bit more, it doesn't feel like he's just kind of cashing in on the death of someone that just recently occurred. I feel like there's actually a bit of substance to it, which I liked overall. This track itself is also one of the stronger ones, I would say, on here. It's a decent cut overall. And then there's the track Street Dreams 2, which tells a pretty interesting story that, even though it's not real, it's all kind of this dream of sorts that Logic is having. It's a fairly interesting one. He's fairly engaging when it comes to the storytelling on here. It kind of reminds me at times of like an older Eminem type of storytelling in a sense, especially when it comes to the ending and this the revelation that he's actually the one who was involved in this kidnapping of his wife. Kind of reminded me of the end of Stan, where Eminem realizes that the one who the letter that he's reading and responding to is the person who drove off the bridge. Kind of reminded me of that, not necessarily in a bad way. And overall, I felt like this track was pretty engaging overall, and I kind of wish that there were more songs on this project that had a structure or a feel similar to this song, because I feel like when Logic is telling stories like this, even if they're not necessarily real stories, even if they're a lot more metaphorical like this one is, I feel like he's at his strongest pretty much. But unfortunately, that's not the case for a lot of the songs on here. Logic throughout this thing still manages to show off that he is a very talented MC. His rapping abilities are very high. There's many moments on this thing where he'll be rapping rather quickly, showing off technical skill and all that, and I've always given him props for that, and I'd have to do the same here. The production on this project is also pretty decent throughout. There weren't really many tracks that blew me away or anything like that in terms of their production, but none of it was really bad either. It was all just pretty solid, and it matched up with Logic pretty nicely, especially on tracks like Wu-Tang Forever that I was talking about before. But as I said before, this album has a good many problems with it too, despite some of the positive things I was able to find through it. One of the biggest problems that carries over from everybody is just the amount of time on this album spent like talking pretty much, instead of taking those ideas and translating them into actual song topics. The two biggest offenders of this, I feel, are the opening and closing tracks to the album. And for the opening track, Thank You, as I said earlier, the song starts off with that skit part that's kind of tying it into Logic's other albums. That's all fine and dandy. Then it moves into the actual song part, and it's a song pretty much where he's thanking his fans and all that. But later into the track, there gets to a point where Logic's just kind of playing over these recordings of his fans, thanking him and all that, typical fan stuff pretty much. And this goes on for a good few minutes of the track, and it's just so uninteresting to me. I mean, I could understand why Logic would care. Obviously, he'd be pretty happy that he helped all these people, and I could think that hardcore Logic fans, people who really care about Logic and all that, might be interested in hearing this too. But to more casual fans, I don't really see much benefit in listening to this. It's just several minutes of people going on and on, pretty much saying the same stuff about how Logic has helped them, thanking Logic and all that. It's just really uninteresting to listen to. And this is the opening song to the album, and several minutes of it are dedicated to this thing here. And that, added with the skit that opens up the song, makes the most memorable parts of this song not the actual song part of the song itself, and for all the wrong reasons really. But this isn't even as bad as it gets on the project, because the closing track, Last Call, is another one where Logic decides to spend a lot of the time on the track just talking instead of rapping pretty much. This is a big problem on everybody, and here on this track in particular it's a big problem as well. He's kind of talking about his come up here on this track, his personal story and all that, and there are moments on the track where he is rapping, but there's also a lot where he just decides to stop and tell you his life story, like quite literally speak, and talk to you about his come up, his life story and all that, just in a spoken sort of format, not even like a spoken word poetic type way. It's just like you've run into him on the street and you asked him about his personal life and he's just talking to you pretty much. And what he's saying here, the story he's telling, is fairly interesting, I would say. He's talked about some of the stuff on here before in previous material of his, so in that regard, some fans might not find it super interesting, but on its own, it's interesting enough to maybe work as a song. But with how much talking there is here, it's just not that interesting. Really, I wish he had taken the stuff that he spent talking about here on the song, translating it into lyrics, and then rapping those lyrics, because that's what rappers are do pretty much. They take ideas they take stories they want to tell, change them into lyrics, and then rap them. That's kind of the business, pretty much. And this track, it's just not that interesting, especially because it goes on for so long. This track is like 10 minutes long, and it just doesn't need to be that long. It's just easily one of the least interesting songs on the entire project. Despite the fact that this album is supposed to be Logic kind of going for the whole boom bap type sound, there are some moments on this thing that are pretty reminiscent of some of the poppier tendencies that popped up on Everybody. In particular, you have the track One Day, which features Ryan Tedder on it. Easily, I feel like it's trying to be this album's version of like the Suicide Hotline track from the last album. Not thematically speaking, that is, but in terms of it being like the big pop crossover song. Of course, with that very poppy chorus that Ryan Tedder provides here, and just the more kind of upbeat, positive lyrics that Logic has in his verses. I feel like it was easy. This track was easily trying to go for some crossover success, and it's just not a track that really interested me all that much. And the song Ordinary Day also feels a little bit poppier than much of the rest of this project. These two songs feel like they were, possibly striving to appeal to that crowd that Logic probably picked up with the success that Everybody had going along with it. While Logic is certainly rapping with a high level of skill on this thing, as I mentioned before, a lot of the tracks on this thing don't really feel like they have all that much lyrical substance to them, I guess you could say. Like, he spends a lot of it rapping about how he's one of the best, or his whole peace, love, positivity message that he has going for him. And these aren't, necessarily bad topics on their own, but they get repeated so much, not really presented in a very interesting way, and they're things that he's talked about before on previous works. It's just not super interesting to me. While you have tracks on here like Everybody Dies and The Return, for example, that have Logic rapping in a pretty decent way, I guess you could say. They're not super interesting songs in terms of their subject matter, and really don't want me to return to them for that reason. You also have the track on here, Legacy, which is kind of an interesting one. Logic's on the song is talking about how his legacy really isn't all that important compared to, living his life and being there for the people in his life. In particular, he kind of imagines out this fantasy where, in the future, he's not there for his wife and his kids because he's too busy, working at his, career, forming a legacy for himself, and he's not there for people in his life when they need them. And this is all fine and dandy and stuff. I think the track is actually another one of the stronger points on here on its own. But, for that message, I just feel like it's kind of odd how much of the rest of the album has Logic kind of, bragging about how he's one of the best and all of that. It just feels a little bit off. And sure, I guess you could make the argument that maybe, considering that this song comes in the end of the track listing, that it's him kind of reflecting on this and maybe having a change of heart of sorts. But I really did not feel like that was, the case here. You also have the track The Adventures of Stony Bob on here, which just was a really boring weed song, pretty much. It's just another track about Logic talking about smoking weed and how much he likes that. I mean, there was a song on his last mixtape, Bobby Tarantino 2, that just came out earlier this year that was also about smoking weed and is pretty much like the same song subject matter-wise. The only difference is the project they appear on. Both songs are also 4 minutes and 20 seconds long as well, which was, something that whenever the first person who ever made a song about weed 4 minutes and 20 seconds long, the first person to ever do that, it was probably funny then. But by this point, it's not all that funny anymore, especially when it was done 2 times in 1 year by the same artist. It's just easily one of the most boring songs on the album that, doesn't have any of that talking in it that I mentioned before. It's easily the most boring that's just, rapping straight through pretty much. So, overall, I wasn't super hot on this album, if you couldn't already tell. There are things about it that I enjoyed, and as I said before, I do think it is a slight improvement over Everybody. But it still did not interest me all that much. There's a couple tracks in here that I thought were interesting in terms of their ideas that they had, or maybe had a somewhat interesting execution. The Wu-Tang track was also pretty fun. For the feature on it as well. However, so much of this album I just feel wasn't all that interesting, either because there was just long segments of talking, just songs without any real interesting meaning to them all that much. It was just kind of a dull listen for me, and the fact that it's also a pretty long project at almost an hour and 15 minutes in length, it just didn't feel worth the listen, honestly. And overall, if I had any advice for Logic, which, of course, I don't know what's best for him necessarily. Obviously, I don't know his personal life and anything like that. But, my advice would kind of be to slow things down a little bit when it comes to project releases. As I said before, this is the second project he's dropped this year, and on this thing he talks about how he has like 5 unreleased albums. There's one of them that he name drops on there. I think it was like Ultra 85 or something like that. He mentions that he's working on more Bobby Tarantino as well, so I'm guessing we're getting more mixtapes in that series sometime in the future. And since his debut album dropped, he's released a project every year, so he's certainly put out a ton of content. But I feel like maybe by slowing things down a bit and focusing a bit more, he'd be able to have some more interesting, fully developed songs. Because I feel like a lot of his more recent output maybe has some interesting ideas, has a track or two or a handful of tracks that are somewhat interesting, but the rest just kind of fall flat. But that is just my own personal opinion on it. Feel free to have your own. If you love this thing, if you hated this thing, if you were on either extreme, that in compared to me, who was more so in the middle, perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, countdown list, discussion videos, all that good stuff. If you want to see it, make sure you subscribe. And with that said, guys, thank you for watching, and stay golden.